Okay, so we'll start tonight's talk, which is, as you can see, and you knew in advance, Alston Moor and the Great War. Well, the first year and a half of the war or so were the most active for communities on the home front, such as Alston Moor, until life under war conditions established a routine of fundraising, of sending comforts to the soldiers at the front, recruiting drives by the army, and then the arrival of those awful brown envelopes that always brought news of the wounded, the missing, or a death. In August 1914, the situation was completely new. Everyone had to adapt. Everyone wanted to do their bit. Alston Moor, being Alston Moor, was different. The main employer was the Ville-Montagne Zinc Company of Belgium. They employed hundreds of men on Alston Moor. I think just before the war, it was up to 600 employees, including a large international workforce. People came from all over Europe. Sometimes men brought their families with them to live in Nenthead. Some were sort of in transit for a specific task. Swedes, Hungarians, Romanians came to install equipment. Some people were here for the long term. Germans were the technical people, the mine managers. The Belgians in general seemed to be the administrators, and the Italians, the specialist workforce. And the children went to the school here. This is Nenthead School, Group 4, as you can see. And these children, this is Paul, Kathy, and Marion Rydell, 3 German children. And I was told that when war broke out and their families had to leave, that they were in tears because this was the life that they had always known. And in the end, they became the enemy. So on the 3rd of August, tensions must have been high. Well, they were high in Europe, but in Nenthead, there must have been a semblance of normality. The Italians, the Belgians, the Germans, the English going to work, rubbing shoulders with each other. And then on the 4th of August, the situation changed. Overnight, Belgium were the victims, Germany was the aggressor, Britain was the defender, and the Italians were neutral. Odd things happened on Alston. There was a German Oompa band, I suppose it would be, touring the country. On the 4th of August, nobody wanted to know them. They had nowhere to go. A farmer offered them a barn, but it was too, I suppose, in too disgraceful a condition for them to sleep in. We don't know what happened to them, but in the end, they must have been interned. But it wasn't their war. They just wanted to play music. Nightshirts and bed linen were collected in Nenthead for the hospital in Hexham. The lady who organised this was Mrs. Rodewald, the German wife of the German mine manager. Some of the Belgians, or the Belgians that were able, went home to fight the Germans. This photograph was taken in 1910, when the Rampgill ore dressing mill was brand new, and this is the commissioning of the engines here. Here we have Hans and Rudolf Rodewald, brothers, the mine managers. And in September 1914, the Germans employed by the company were interned. Hans, we don't know what happened to Hans. Perhaps he had forewarning of this and he was not interned. He obviously was not in this country. Rudolf, however, stayed on to work in Nenthead, which is very curious. And it was a puzzle. He didn't leave Nenthead until the spring in 1915. This puzzled me until a German acquaintance researched Hans and found out that he had spent several years in America and had become a naturalized American citizen. But by spring 1915, hostility towards the Germans was intense, and he applied for an emergency passport to leave the country. So he was the last German to leave the area. Over in Allendale, there was a gentleman called Carl Schmidt managing the Barney Craig mine. and he had married a farmer's daughter called Lizzie Robson, and he was interned in Hexham, being over the border into Northumberland. But there was an outcry in Allendale. How dare you take away our Lizzie's husband? He's our mine manager. We need him to manage the mine. And so he was released. But this was to no avail because it was a government edict. He had to be re-arrested and interned. In Alston, on the 14th of September 1914, there was the first recruitment drive by the Border Regiment. These 9 men were recruited. Later in the month, another 5 went, and recruitment continued at intervals during the war. This is Alston Town Hall. You can see the not ghostly, mysterious pair of hands waving the flags, all patriotic. And we do know the identity of 2 of these men. There's Thomas Walton of High Low Lady Shield, and Lance Sergeant William, or the gentleman who became Lance Sergeant, he was William Turnbull, sorry. This is Private Walton, recognisable by his droopy moustache. Lovelady Shield is about halfway between Alston and Nenthead. Lance Sergeant Turnbull, well, William Turnbull had come to Alston about 4 years before the war to work as a joiner on the North Eastern Railway. He was an athlete, and he had run from Alston to Hartside in a remarkably short time. Don't know specifically what the short time was. It wasn't reported in the newspaper. But that's 2 out of the 7 that we know of. This photograph was taken at the entrance to Harbert Lodge, just outside Alston on the Brampton Road, and this is the Yielder family. Once Belgium had been overrun by the Germans, Belgians fled from the Germans, and many came to Britain, where they were welcomed with open arms, unlike refugees today. And Mrs. Yielder and at least one of the daughters went to London to arrange for Belgian refugees to be housed in Alston. Alston House was originally called Alston House, but for a time it was a Hillcrest. It was the Hillcrest during the First World War. It was vacant at the time. It was owned by a gentleman called George, sorry, I've forgotten his name, Mr. Welford, who lived in Gosforth near Newcastle. And he very kindly gave this for use by the Belgian refugees. Its 14 bedrooms were fitted out by donations from local people. And in the last week in October, the people of Nenthead turned out with a procession and a brass band playing the Belgian national anthem to welcome the Belgian manager, Monsieur Dupont, his wife and his daughter and his niece. He had been to Belgium to rescue his relatives and bring them back to a safe haven. But it's good that the people of Nenthead thought so highly of the Belgians, and the feeling of sympathy, empathy, that they should welcome this foreigner back into his home here. On another front, the fundraising at Samuel King School, there was fundraising throughout the community. Fundraising at the Samuel King School in particular made the newspaper reports, along with other help for the refugees. One novelty fundraising donation was that each of the pupils was asked to bring in a potato. 2.5 stones of potatoes were collected to help feed the Belgian refugees. So that was more or less the situation at the end of 1914. By January 1915, about 50 men of Alston Moor had been recruited, and more were going. However, the war was beginning to take its toll on the economy of the country and the local economy. Local industries were affected. This is the brewery. It's still called a brewery, even though it ceased to be a brewery about in the 1880s. During the First World War, it was a stocking factory. And a shortage of wool, the raw material for stockings, mainly for the miners, was in short supply, and prices increased rapidly because of the demand to make clothes, uniforms for the soldiers. Mr. Story, the owner of the woolen factory, I should say, was unable to supply an order for 30,000 pairs of stockings due to the shortage of wool and the price increase. The Vale Montagne was unable to have communication with head office in Belgium. In fact, the head office was now in occupied territory, producing material that would aid the enemy. And so the Vale Montagne here was treated sort of with suspicion for a time, but it was unable to export, which in turn affected the local branch line, the freight transport on the local line, because nothing was being, none of the mineral, the zinc, was being exported from Alston Moor to Tyneside for shipment to Belgium. The local limestone quarry had to close due to a shortage of labour. Local milk sellers met in the Masonic Hall, and even though the cost of feed for cows had increased, they agreed not to raise the price of milk. So you can see the war permeated all aspects of society on Alston Moor. In January 1915, the first soldier to convalesce in the Ruth Lancaster James Cottage Hospital arrived. But he was not British. He was a Belgian soldier. He'd been wounded in Belgium and been to 2 hospitals on the continent before he was brought over to England, to Southampton, to Netley Hospital, and then up to Perth to convalesce. So what on earth is he doing in Alston? Well, this is one of the little miracles that sometimes happens during war. His family were among the Belgian refugees that had come to Alston, and he had found that his wife and children were here, and he was able to get permission to come to Alston to be with his family during his convalescence. And that's just a wonderful little story. This is the only photo that we have of Alston Workhouse, now Fairhill Cottages. The Board of Guardians of Alston Moor considered opening up the workhouse to evacuees of aged and infirm people from Newcastle, just in case Newcastle was bombed. Scarborough had been shelled from the sea. Tyneside might have been shelled. Zeppelins were always a threat, or at least in the early days, but the offer was not taken up. By March 1915, Monsieur de Meer, the Belgian soldier, was fit to return to the Belgian army. There was still a little piece of Belgium that had not been taken by the Germans. So a brass band, they were great at drumming up brass bands, whatever the occasion was. A brass band met outside the Hillcrest and escorted Monsieur de Meer to the railway station, where he boarded the train. And as part of the excitement, fog signals were laid on the track so that they exploded as the engine ran over them. And I'm just wondering if Monsieur de Meer remembered what he was going back to, because this must have been for all the world like gunfire and explosions. But he went back to do his duty. Lloyd Thompson was a pupil teacher who lived with his parents at Spring House at Town Foot in Alston. He had joined the North Staffordshire Regiment for some reason, and in April 1915 he returned home on leave and went back to his old school and gave out the school prizes, and probably did a bit of promotion as well, bit of PR work. He was later promoted to second lieutenant. The women of Alston Moor continued to make cakes and send food parcels. In Nenthead, these activities were organised by Mrs. Boast, the French wife of the Belgian secretary of the Vale Montagne Company. Mr. Boast was she was president of the local Red Cross, while Mr. Boast was extremely involved with the Agricultural Society in Nenthead. So these people did integrate. This lady is Mina Lee. She came from the family who farmed at Randalholm, just outside Alston on the road to Kirkhoff, the back road to Kirkhoff. On the outbreak of war, she was a fully trained nurse. On the outbreak of war, she went to join a privately run field hospital for French soldiers that had been given and was fully equipped by Lady Weems of Weems Castle near Ayr. And Mina Lee wrote letters home that were published in the newspapers, and they were published in full while the war was still a novelty. And one of the things that was quite charming, I suppose, was that she wrote in one of her letters, "Aeroplanes and biplanes are a common sight here, and it is very marvellous to see them. We saw one just above the chateau the other day. It is so strange to see people flying in the air." The days of innocence. From France, Mina Lee went out to Salonika, to the Red Cross Hospital, to join, by coincidence, two other ladies from Alston, the sisters Wilhelmina James and Mabel James of Clargill Hall. On her way to Greece and the front at Salonika, there was time for a bit of sightseeing. So Alexandria or Cairo would have been the first port of call. And as you can see, this is Mina Lee, third from the left, sitting on a camel, doing what tourists do now. And so she went from there to Salonika. And it was around about this time, on the 26th of April, Alston received news of its first fatality. James Bennett of Nenthead had been killed on that day. Excuse me. This is Theodore and Isabella Prumbaum. Theodore was a German foreman in the mines. They lived at hilltop cottages at Nenthead. Theodore had been interned. Isabella was left to fend for herself. She made a claim to the Board of Guardians for financial help, but in her interview, her answers to questions were considered to be evasive and unsatisfactory, and so she wasn't eligible for financial aid. The situation was pretty bad for Isabella, because she was not from Nenthead. She had no support network, no family. She was from Tyneside. And so she was an outsider. Her husband was a German, and hostility, as the wounded and names of the dead were read out, hostility towards the Germans, any German association, was just was tragic. One day, Isabella, the family story is given to me by her granddaughter, that one day she was walking along the street in Nenthead with her two little girls, and somebody opened an upstairs window and emptied the contents of a chamber pot over her and shouted to her, "Get back to Germany with your little German bastards." So, but poor Isabella, she did stick it out for the duration of the war, knowing that when the war ended, Theodore would come back to her, which he did, but not for long. The ill feeling was still so bad that he went to Germany. And I suspect that they were Catholics because they did not divorce. But Isabella stayed in this country and went back to Tyneside. There was another wife of a German, Hannah Jaeger, the wife of Julius Jaeger, the mine manager at Rotherham, and they lived at Blackburn Bank on the way to Hardside. She applied for financial aid and had a successful claim. She was assisted. That was 2 years later. She stuck it out until then. While he was in the prisoner of war camp, interned in the Isle of Man, there's a lot of time to spend, and Theodore made these little carvings from bones from the stew. They're dated they're not terribly good photographs, but one of these, there's napkin rings as well. And one of them is described, he's inscribed with, "From your loving Pappy." And this is a pin cushion here, and beautifully carved. You can tell how much he missed his family. And as I said earlier, this was not their war. They just wanted to earn a living in their new home. You think of the First World War as being a trench war. It was mostly. I mean, my own grandfather was a cavalryman, and several Alston men joined the Westmoreland and Cumberland Yeomanry. But by the spring of 1915, large numbers of cavalry were not what was required. Messengers, spies, There was a demand for mobility, but not by horses. And the second, I think it was, of the 3rd Division of the Westmoreland and Cumberland Yeomanry had their horses taken away and given bicycles. And so, well, I'll read you the inscription on this gravestone. It says, "Sacred to the memory of," and there's the picture of the spur. "Born 30th of the 10th, 1914. Departed 4th of the 7th, 1916. And then a poem. "Stranger, pause and shed a tear. A regiment's heart lies buried here. Sickened and died through no disorder, but broken by a staggering order. Our hearts were warm, theirs cold as icicles, to take our horses and give us bicycles. For cavalry, they said, there was no room, so we buried our spurs in this blasted tomb. The ordnance gave, the ordnance hath taken away. R.I.P. Return if possible." This is Townhead in Alston. On the 24th of May 1915, Italy joined the war on the side of the Allies. In June, the Italians that worked for the Via Montagna in Nenthead enlisted, or set off for Italy to enlist. They gathered at the junction in Alston and marched down the front street singing patriotic Italian songs, and they were given a good send-off. But they must have been given rifles as soon as they disembarked, because within 2 months news came to their friends in Nenthead that Galbentio Corsi had been killed, and Giuseppe Samonini and either Giuseppe or his brother Gasparo Pala had been wounded. So they'd had next to no training. Despite all this chaos of the war, drastic things happening, the fatalities were beginning to hit home. Despite all this, Alston in the newspapers was being promoted as a health resort for fishing, walking, and bracing air. And quite bizarrely, in the summer of 1915, some tourists had to be turned away for lack of accommodation. Part of the reality of war was national registration. Everyone had to carry this card. You can see this lady, Evelyn Elliott, lived at Oaklands in Alston. Lighting restrictions were imposed even on Alston Moor due to the perceived threat of Zeppelin raids. And there had been one or two, mainly in the south, but nevertheless, there was one rule for everyone. Industrial Tyneside was a target. Zeppelins were sort of fairly unreliable, prone to being blown about by the wind. So who knows, a raid by Zeppelins on Newcastle, there might have been a stray Zeppelin come up the Tyne Valley and just offloaded its bombs anywhere before it set off home. Letters about trench life appeared in the press. John Dryden of Fairhill at Nenthead wrote to his mother, "Since I joined the colours, I've gone through a lot and seen a lot. I thought that when we were in England, we had a grand and jolly time of it. But since we left its shores, we have got to know what life is like. Although I do not wish to go back to my native home, for I have left for a good cause and intend to do my duty if God spares me. Trench life is all right in fine weather, but in wet weather, it is chronic. Sometimes you're up to your knees in mud and water. I've not received a scratch yet, but I have had some near escapes, and comrades have fallen beside me. We can see the Germans walking about in their trenches. They sometimes yell like pigs." Recruitment and fundraising still went on. At Ledgate School, in October, the school logbook noted that 4 pairs of socks had been washed by the children. The head teacher's note said that this giving a lesson in washing woolens and an interest in the soldiers. Older girls were knitting mufflers and prayers were said daily, as they were in every school. Throughout the country, blacksmiths were given government quotas to make horseshoes. At the forge at Townhead in Alston, John Little, part of the Little blacksmith dynasty, made 100 horseshoes per week, and by the end of the war, he had made 17,000. In addition to his normal workload, His normal workload was not disrupted. This was extra work. And only 7 had been returned faulty, 5 of which had been damaged in transit. That's a pretty good record. The Belgians at the Hillcrest felt frustrated. They couldn't go home to fight the war. Maybe they were too old. But anyway, they wanted to do something towards the war effort, and a lot of them left for Newcastle to work in munitions factories. The Vale Montagne was still struggling and asked the government for an export license to export their product to the USA and to South America. The Belgians still were in the Hillcrest, and even though they were our allies and refugees, they were still looked upon with suspicion because they might have been traitors, they might have been spies. And one person who fell foul of restrictions on the movement of refugees was Eliza Oudemans. I'll quote from my own book. She was aged 25, living at the Hillcrest. She was charged with failing to notify her change of address, but she pleaded not guilty. Her offence was having stayed with Belgian friends in Newcastle for the weekend. She could have been fined £100, an inconceivable amount, or given 6 months in prison, which indicated the seriousness of the case, but instead she was let off with a caution on her promise not to reoffend. Another interesting story, an epic story from the front, well, not the front, the home front, was about an Albert Cairns. He was the son of Mr. Cairns of Grange House in Alston. He had previously been a chauffeur, so he had a wide mechanical knowledge, an experience. And on enlisting in 1915, he was accepted, first of all, into the Royal Navy Air Service as a first-class mechanic. This is when the internal combustion engine was still a novelty, and there was a shortage of motor drivers. He first saw service in France and was promoted and posted back to England with a remarkable record to his credit. He changed from motor vehicles to flying machines and took part in a defence of London against an air raid, flying over the city in a seaplane. When his seaplane was at a great height, he somehow managed to fall from it into the sea, and on the way down he was caught by the propeller blade. Amazingly, he survived this incident, and after treatment he was discharged from the Navy as medically incapacitated for further service. That's quite a miraculous survival. Men from Alston weren't only on the Western Front. Some went to the Middle East, to Mesopotamia. This is Fred Kearton from the well-known building company of Keartons. They were stonemasons, obviously, general builders, joiners in particular, as well as undertakers. And obviously, Fred Kearton had time to spare. He carved this. Elsewhere, we know of at least one man who went to East Africa to fight against the Germans in their African colonies. This was Thomas Howard Irwin, who joined the Royal Army Service Corps in East Africa, but he died there, sadly, probably of dysentery. This is Joseph Hodgson and William Teasdale. These two men, together with their friend Albert Hewitson, were great pals who stayed together during the war. Joseph Hodgson was badly affected by a mustard gas attack in May at the Battle of Ypres, and he had to be invalided home. This is Noel Oxland. The first 5 men killed from Alston were James Bennett, killed by a shell on the 26th of April. Thomas Railton, the son of the Alston station master, who was in the National Reserve as a professional soldier at the relatively advanced age of 42, and he was killed on the 16th of June. William J. Little was one of the first Alston men to enlist because he was a travelling salesman. He could ride a motorbike. He became a dispatch rider. He was killed on the 8th of July. There was Robert Gill, whose family had moved to Consett, where Robert worked in the coal mines. He died of wounds on the 7th of December. Noel Oxland had died earlier in the year. He was one of Alston's young set, and this is him They used to go cycling. Oh, he was a great friend of Joan Walton's mother. Joan was one of those marvellous characters who had a photographic memory and lots of stories to tell about life on Alston, going back. She remembered what her mother told her. And Joan Walton's mother used to go cycling with Noel Oxland and play tennis with him. He was a member of St. Augustine's Hockey Club. Can't imagine having a hockey club now, but there was all sorts of activities. He was killed on the 9th of August. In Salonika. He was the only child of Reverend William Oxland, the vicar of St. Augustine's. He had attended Worcester College, and he was one of the war poets. His poem, Outward Bound, was first published in the Times in 1915. There are 2 portraits of Noel in St. Augustine's, one each side of the altar, commissioned by his father. Each portrait has a halo, represents a saint. St. George and St. Alban. St. Alban being the first Christian soldier to be made a saint, a martyr. Joan Walton told me that Noel's mother did not like the portraits. She found them too upsetting, so upsetting that she could not attend church. Joan's mother also felt uncomfortable when she went to church to see Noel's portraits. The Reverend Oxland had a nervous breakdown soon afterwards, and he was retired from the ministry. Noel Oxland features in this book, The Final Whistle, The Great War in 15 Players. His chapter is number 5, titled Noel Oxland, A Green Hill Far Away. The 15 players were members of Rosslyn Rugby Club in London, none of whom lived to hear the final whistle when the war was over. Early in 1916, it seems that soldiers' letters stopped being published, perhaps because everyone knew by now what life was like at the front. It was no longer a novelty or newsworthy, and the casualty list was growing. One of those who died was one of Alston's first recruits, that joiner and athlete, Lance Sergeant William Turnbull, who died of a severe wound to the head on the 6th of August, aged 24. By now, life with the war had established a routine at home of fundraising and recruiting. Local children were doing their bit, sending sweets and gathering sphagnum moss. And I'll leave you to work out what that was for. One fundraising event was an auction sale on the Saturday before Christmas in 1916 in aid of the Red Cross. The sale lasted from 3 p.m. to 9 p.m. with a 1-hour break for tea. It was reported in the newspaper, and part of the report read that goods were bought and given back so often that one began to wonder whenever the sale would finish. Among the noteworthy items was a glass sugar basin, given by a poor woman whose only son was at war. The article was sold and resold until it made 28 shillings. The last purchaser returned it to the donor. That's a heartwarming story. We roll on to 1917. Alston Station again. In January, early in the morning, 1916, there was a police raid. 7 miners were arrested and taken before a military tribunal. Their fault was that they had been zinc and lead miners in Nenthead working for the Ville Montagne, but there was insufficient work for them, so they had become coal miners at Plenmella Colliery, further down the railway line to Haltwhistle, but they had not notified the authorities. Working for the Ville Montagne was a, the exempted occupation, but they should have notified the authorities. However, they were forgiven and they all joined up. But a dramatic incident at Alston railway station. Lloyd Thompson, this is the former pupil. They haven't got a better photograph, unfortunately. He was the teacher at the elementary school who had come back to award prizes. He was killed on the 25th of January in Mesopotamia at the age of 23. Like so many young men, his future had been a bright one. Before the war, he had been awarded a 3-year scholarship to study geology in Switzerland. A framed photo of him was given to the school by his parents. What happened to the photograph? So it's gone into oblivion. Something else that also went into oblivion was this piece of embroidery. Unfortunately, I'm not the world's best photographer. This little piece of cloth was rescued from a skip in Garrigill some years ago and given to Alston Moor Historical Society. So it got the initials PC, Netley, May 1917. I did not have a clue what this was about. But with research, I found that Netley was the hospital at Southampton. So PC, I found, was Percy Coulthard of West Ashgill, who had been a lead miner and had moved to Ryton with his wife. He joined the Northumberland Fusiliers. He had been wounded, and in May 1917, he was recovering in Netley Hospital. So this embroidery must have been therapeutic exercise. He returned to France, but was killed shortly afterwards on the 13th of July, 1917. He's about one of 20 men from Alston Moor not listed on rolls of honour anywhere. Percy Coulthard. This is an unusual view of Alston Workhouse. The Board of Guardians made an offer to the government that it should be used as a convalescent home, but it was declined. Perhaps it was too remote. The 6 inmates of Alston Workhouse had been moved to Brampton because it was not an economic unit to look after 6 residents only. So the place was empty, in need of a use, but not as a convalescent home. This is Henri Loupart, one of the Belgians who worked at Nenthead. He had gone to fight for his country early in the war, and nothing more had been heard of him. So in September, as late as September 1917, news arrived that Henri Loupart was a prisoner of war. So that was a relief. He was going to survive. Oh, there was a fair chance he would survive. Thinking of Nenthead, there was still fundraising. This was a continuous occupation throughout the war. There was this bizarre musical comedy in Nenthead in aid of blinded soldiers. And it was insensitively called Could We But See. That would never be tolerated now. But anyway, it raised £18. This is Joseph William Collinson, the son of William Collinson, a saddler who had moved up to Alston from Penrith, and whose shop was next to the Quaker Meeting House, where Saddler's Cafe is now, and that is why it's called Saddler's, because of Joseph's father's occupation and his older brother Lawrence, who must have been exempted from service. Sadly, Joseph was killed in action on the 20th of August 1917. And this is the letter that notified his parents, as I said, one of the dreaded brown envelopes. My own great-grandparents received such a brown envelope to say that my grandfather was missing, not necessarily dead. It turned out he was a prisoner of war. But here we read, "It is my painful duty to inform you that a report has been received from the War Office notifying the death of Private Joseph William Collinson." There's the dreaded knock on the door when that arrived. The death toll was mounting. This is Sidney Stevens, killed 15th of July, 1917. Albert Hewison, one of the 3 pals from Nenthead. He was killed on the 26th of October at Passchendaele Ridge at the age of 23. By coincidence, his pal, William Teasdale, was killed on the same day. The 3rd pal, Joseph Hodgson, the one who had been gassed at Ypres, survived the war. They had been together as much as they could, and 2 of them died the same day. An interesting effect of the war, a different Thomas Walton arrived home to find that his wife had been having an affair with an Italian corporal. She had become pregnant, and there isn't time for everyone to read this full report. There isn't time to read the full report, but you'll see here that she blamed the petitioner for her condition. She said she was going to halt whistle for a certain purpose. So she was pregnant and going for an abortion. Thomas Walton was granted a decree nisi, or nisi. Very rarely there was good news from the front. This is Sapper John Herdman, who had been a general labourer in the limestone quarry, living with his mother, sister and younger brother in 2 rooms in a house in Crown Lane. He was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal. This is unfortunately not a very good scan of a document, but Second Lieutenant Harold Story, who was the son of Thomas Story, an Alston dentist. Harold Story himself had been a dentist. He had been severely wounded by shrapnel in the left side of his chest, but he had recovered, and he was awarded the Military Cross in autumn 1917. With no end to the war in sight, fundraising continued, recruitment continued, and the list of deaths grew longer. Men were being discharged from the army. Welcome home committees were set up in Alston, Garrigill and Nenthead for servicemen, some of whom had been wounded and discharged as medically unfit. There were grants given, sums of money, tokens as a welcome home to allow the men to find their feet, basically. Women of Alston Moor played their part. We've seen Mina Lee. This is Wilhelmina Martha James, who I've mentioned, who at the age of 69 went with her slightly younger sister Mabel to work with the Red Cross on the Salonika front, which doesn't make the news. It wasn't so drastic. It was a fairly static front, where the Allies, the French and the British, were fighting the Austrians and the Bulgarians. But the terrain was swampy and boggy. It was an unhealthy place to be. So there was a lot of sickness. But into 1918, Wilhelmina Martha James came home. She was awarded the Royal Serbian Order of St. Sava by the King of Serbia. And she was later awarded the OBE. Incidentally, the sister of the time of the Ruth Lancaster James Hospital, I think she was a Miss Parker. She went off to help nurse the soldiers as well. Unfortunately, we know nothing about her. This is Mina Lee. Mina Lee, when she came back, she was decorated with the Royal Red Cross, which I think we see there, by King George at Buckingham Palace for services rendered. And afterwards, she was received by Queen Alexandra at Marlborough House. This is Jack Pickering. The last piece of news about any soldier from Alston Moor was about stretcher bearer Jack Pickering, who had been a grocer's assistant before he joined the Royal Army Medical Corps. He had been awarded the Military Medal for conspicuous bravery on the field on many occasions, but he had been too modest to tell anyone about it, including his family. It was up to his pals at the front to write home to tell everyone. A modest man, Jack Pickering. Finally, Germany surrendered. And I'll quote you the newspaper cutting of how Alston received the news. Alston's reception of the armistice. Alston received the news of the signing of the armistice in a very quiet fashion, and the only outward celebration was the hoisting of a few flags. In the evening, the children paraded the streets, singing and waving flags, and later made a bonfire on the recreation ground, that's the Fairhill. Mr. Story's workpeople at the stocking factory had a holiday on Wednesday, but he was the only employer to celebrate this great event in this manner. very subdued. So maybe it was too much of a relief that at last the war was over, too early to celebrate. This is the Tyne-Cot War Memorial, the largest memorial and cemetery in the world. 327 men and women of Alston Moor so far are known to have participated in the First World War, with 91 names of those who died, 90 men and 1 woman. Alice Rennick was a nurse, and she had moved from Alston to Allendale. She went to nurse the soldiers, and she lived beyond the 11th of November, but she died of the Spanish flu. So she is remembered on Alston War Memorial. Most of the 91 names are recorded on the various war memorials and rolls of honour, but there's about 20 who aren't. But 91, that's almost a third of the 327. It's very disproportionate to the national average, and a very puzzling statistic. It needs investigating. I haven't done it yet, but I wouldn't know where to start. Various people collected newspaper cuttings. You can see here these dates are 1918, 1919. And these newspaper cuttings, such as these, with information, with such information, are as near first-hand as we can get to bring home the reality of war and the emotions subsequent to that. It's not just the brown envelopes and the across the garden fence type of conversation, but the newspapers did their best to keep everyone up to date. And generally, the local newspapers treated the news with sympathy and respect. This is Alston Marketplace, as you probably know. After the war, a trophy in the shape of a captured German howitzer, I think it was a howitzer, was put on display at the Market Cross, but it was so unpopular that it had to be removed, because that might have been a gun that killed an Alston soldier. So after the war, memorials were erected and rolls of honour, the final rolls of honour, were put up in churches and chapels. There are 2 obelisk memorials and 12 known rolls of honour on Alston Moor, some of which have disappeared, sadly. In particular, the one from St. Paul's Methodist Church at the top of the town. Luckily, there are photographs. In Carrigal, there's a handmade scroll with St. George in the middle. These commemorate both world wars, and all of the men who went off to war who served are commemorated here, not only those who gave their lives. At Nenthead, this grand ornate memorial commemorates the death of the memory of 6 men of Nenthead who gave their lives. It's just at the road junction over the bridge at Nenthead before you turn right. It's straight ahead of you. A war memorial was proposed at Nenthead. As you can see, a clock scheme was abandoned, but a memorial itself was also abandoned. Henri Loupart, that Belgian prisoner of war, he came home to Nenthead. Nenthead was his home. He designed a war memorial. It might even have been intended to be bigger than the memorial at Alston, and it would have commemorated the deaths of 18 Nenthead men. However, there wasn't enough money to build a memorial. There was the feeling in the village that they did not want to be reminded of it. And apart from that, people were leaving Nenthead. The Ville Montagne did not recover from the First World War. From having a workforce of several hundred men, it was cut down to 50. There just was not the work, not the money. Nenthead was in a severe depression. Even a memorial clock scheme was abandoned. Instead, there's a roll of honour in St. John's Church in Nenthead. Again, handwritten, and the sentiment "Until Dawn" written at the bottom. Alston's War Memorial was unveiled by the Earl of Lonsdale, the Lord Lieutenant of Cumberland, on the 4th of September 1922. It was quite an occasion. And it's something probably to commemorate next year, the 100th anniversary. This is the book that I wrote about the Great War. And it's really the photograph. I chose it out of all the photographs of wartime, of the war in Alston, that period. This is the one I chose. Because here we have some little girls, a woman who might be their mother, and an elderly couple. The person missing from this photograph is the father of the little girls, the husband of the woman, the son of the grandparents, the older couple. And I think that that message says everything about the war, or at least after the war. So that's why it was chosen. So that is everything I have to say within an hour of Alston Moor. But I would like to finish by reading the last verse of Outward Bound, the published poem. He did publish a book of poems, but published privately. And it's recognised that Noel Oxland had great potential. But to finish this evening, I'll read the last verse of his poem. We shall pass in summer weather, we shall come at eventide, where the fells stand up together and all quiet things abide, mixed with cloud and wind and river, sun distilled in dew and rain, one with Cumberland for ever, we shall go not forth again.